Hi, and welcome to another segment of Dr. Gregg Talks Story. Today we're going to be looking further at the pandemic and the worldwide spread of this coronavirus. If you saw our last segment, we were talking about Event 201, which was a pandemic planning exercise actually conducted at Johns Hopkins University back east. And this was funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and the World Economic Forum. During this interactive planning event, people from various different governments, health services, corporations, big tech, basically every sector that might have anything to do with how to handle a pandemic. The interesting thing is that they were specifically planning for the possibility of a worldwide respiratory coronavirus pandemic. That was in October of 2019, 3 months before the official start of the pandemic. Now, at this point, we know that there's evidence through genetic testing that this virus was actually present in Italy for sure in August of that year and quite possibly in the spring of that year. We also know that there was some presence in Spain as well. So there is a lot more research that has been done that is showing that it was called COVID-19 for a reason, that the first evidence of this most certainly was during the year 2019. We're going to look at some various different interesting elements of this pandemic and try to come to an understanding of what exactly happened and whether this was handled in a way that was honest before the public. I'll draw your attention to this paper, which is basically about the ethics of biosafety considerations in gain-of-function research, resulting in the creation of potential pandemic pathogens. Now, in our previous talk, you'll probably remember that I was showing you papers from the National Institutes of Health and their medical library talking about the fact that gain-of-function research was being done in the United States from 2004 to 2014. As of 2012 and 2013, they had a bat coronavirus that would attach to the ACE2 receptor on human cells 99.9% of the time. We'll put those up for you on the screen so that you can see that again in just a review of what we've covered so far. So we have shown that there was research being done on bat coronaviruses to create what is called a chimera. And a chimera is a man-made combination of organisms or two organisms in order to create an entirely new organism. In other words, a lab-formed organism that has a gain of function. What that means is an increase in virulence, and that's taking a virus that's already pathogenic and making it stronger, making it more infectious, increasing the morbidity and the mortality of a virus on purpose. This was being done here in the United States, and it was red flagged in 2014 and then defunded by the Health and Human Services in that year or later that year. Then fast forward, we showed that through the EcoHealth Alliance, Dr. Anthony Fauci, who was the head of the National Institutes of Allergy and Infectious Disease, made sure that this gain-of-function research got shifted over to the Wuhan lab. Now, last time you'll probably remember also that Dr. Zheng Li from the Wuhan lab had her name on all of these research papers that are present in the National Institutes of Health Medical Library. We will again show you that briefly, just as a review. At that time, it triggered a lot of concern among scientists who found out what was happening in the laboratory under Dr. Fauci here in this country. And this paper, which was published in 2015 about medical ethics, was specifically concerning this research that was being done. Last time you'll remember also that we showed papers concerning the research that was being done at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and the fact that there had been a number of viral leaks from that laboratory, and that they were working with bat coronaviruses as well. In fact, they were even using CRISPR technology to do genetic engineering on these viruses. So this was happening, and fast forward here to now our current time, and just within a very short time ago, Bill Gates, who kind of thinks he's a doctor, he's not, he's an IT guy. He was at the Munich Security Conference in Munich, Germany, speaking about the pandemic and about Omicron. At the Munich Security Conference on February 18th, Bill Gates was asked to assess where we are in beating the pandemic. He replied, sadly, the virus itself, particularly the variant called Omicron, is a type of vaccine. That is, it creates both B-cell and T-cell immunity. We're going to go through some of his statements, and perhaps the thing I should state first of all is that Omicron is probably the best thing that has happened, and may very well be an answer to prayer, because it is a much milder form of the coronavirus, and yet it is more infectious. So it's more easily spread, but it's much, much milder, and the result is that it gives herd immunity. This has been shown in Africa and India, who had large spikes from Omicron and then completely fell off to levels below Canada, below the United States, below Great Britain, below France, etc. This article is written by a scientist whose name is Joe Wang. He is a veteran vaccine scientist who spearheaded a vaccine project in 2003 against the original SARS virus. So he is very, very familiar with these subjects. He is known within the scientific world as far as his research on vaccines and on coronaviruses. He states that he was quite confident projecting where Omicron would lead the pandemic given its characteristics after it emerged late last year. You'll probably remember that as it emerged, first of all being spotted in South Africa, they were talking about the fact of how mild this variant was compared to others, but how it was pushing out the Delta form and the Beta form of the virus. So when Bill Gates was making these statements, Mr. Wang, Dr. Wang, made the statement, I'm glad that Bill Gates agrees with me that Omicron is like an effective vaccine that is helping to end the pandemic. But why did Mr. Gates say, sadly? Maybe Mr. Gates, whose foundation funded the development and distribution of COVID-19 vaccines around the world, was sad because of any deaths that occurred. But it doesn't appear so. As he continued, Omicron has done a better job getting out to the world population than we have with our vaccines. That means the chance of severe disease, which is mainly associated with being elderly and having obesity or diabetes, those risks are now dramatically reduced because of that infection exposure. Dr. Wang goes on and says, since reduced risk is good for humanity and something to be desired, what is there to be sad about? Was Gates sad because Omicron beat the vaccines in generating protective immunity, thereby preventing the ability of COVID to spread, meaning that there would be no need for any future COVID vaccines? If vaccines achieve sterilizing immunity, great. If not, instead, naturally occurring Omicron brings an end to the pandemic, equally great. It's not a competition. It's whatever gets the job done. That is, unless you value the success of vaccines more than ending the pandemic. As I've shown in our previous segments, there is an incredible amount of corruption that has surrounded this entire pandemic and how it's handled. There are many, many people who have become extremely rich as a result of everything that has happened. And Dr. Wang goes on and says, almost from the beginning of the pandemic, we were told that the only way out was via vaccination. Vaccines were rapidly developed and the emergency use of them was pushed out. There were vaccine drives in clinics, and before long, boosters became part of the scenario. Then came the vaccine mandates, even for people who had acquired natural immunity, followed by the vaccination of children. Meanwhile, the silencing of any negative information about vaccines, including vaccine safety, continued. I'm going to do a segment specifically on this, so I won't cover this today. But in our talk on Event 201, it was shown that they were not actually following the science. They were following a scenario, a plan that was put in place in October of 2019 as to how to address a worldwide respiratory coronavirus. This was before any of the science was done on this virus, and so they were going directly against large numbers of research scientists and doctors as this entire pandemic response rolled out. I mentioned last time the Great Barrington Declaration and the huge number of scientists who have signed that. Over 900,000 health workers, doctors, and research scientists have signed that document, saying that the pandemic was handled very poorly. One of the interesting things is that as far as an island, like our islands here in Hawaii and specifically Kauai, what would have saved many, many businesses that were destroyed would have been if they mandated testing prior to people coming here, and then a 3-day quarantine with a following test to release people to be able to continue the commerce here and to support businesses here. Unfortunately, that was not done. And there was kind of a knee-jerk response to what the press was saying. Now, you have to understand that the press was completely and totally signed on with this pandemic planning exercise that was done in October of 2019 called Event 201, funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, who are basically the ones who support vaccinating and giving an ID number to everyone in the entire world. They want to vaccinate the world, and they want to give everyone in the world an identification number. That project of theirs is called ID 2020. I strongly encourage you to do some research on Event 201 and ID 2020. Dr. Wang goes on in this paper saying that Gates has made the statement that he is looking ahead to the next pandemic and even faster vaccine development and rollout. Next time we should try and make it, instead of 2 years, we should make it more like 6 months. It took us a lot longer this time than it should have, he said at the Munich conference. He's saying this in spite of the fact that no vaccine has ever been formed and released faster than what was done in the first year or so of the pandemic. This has never been done in history. Vaccines were always tested for toxicity, for safety in pregnancy. They were always tested for teratogenesis, anything having to do with damage to a fetus. They were always tested with long-term animal studies for any kind of long-term effects or cancer-producing effects. This usually means that a vaccine takes 15 years to hit the market by the time they do all these studies. And when you get a circular for any medication, whether it's amoxicillin or tetracycline or it's a vaccine, it comes with a circular that comes in the packaging with the product. That circular has all of these studies that are laid out very carefully with every single study that a doctor can look at and then do a benefit to risk analysis for the particular patient or for the patients in his care at his practice. This was not done with these vaccines at all, and most of you probably realize that there are no long-term studies. In fact, the people who have been vaccinated are the long-term phase 3 study for this vaccine, having to do with everything from safety in pregnancy to teratogenesis, that's the effects on the fetus, and also to things such as toxicity and the formation potentially of cancer-causing diseases and immune-mediated diseases. Dr. Wang goes on and says, all along it's all about the vaccines and less about the disease. As a former vaccine scientist, I should be happy that vaccines have taken the center stage in the world, but I am not. As I am clear that vaccines are not the goal, they're merely the means to help humanity overcome the pandemic. The means should never become the goal. When it turned out that vaccination failed to defeat COVID, and it was instead conquered by Omicron, Mr. Gates found it sad. Humans missed a great opportunity to show that we are the true masters of the world. This is his comment on what has happened. It's interesting because he makes a statement about his background. As a young man brainwashed by the doctrine of communism, I dreamt of engineering genes to solve all the world's problems, such as diseases, food shortages, environmental disasters, etc. I thought that since nature caused so much trouble for humans, it was up to geneticists like myself to change nature by engineering the genes of all creatures to be exactly what we humans would like them to be. Call it arrogance, naivete, or stupidity. That was what I believed, as did millions of other young people in communist China at the time. He goes on and says that he used to worship science and see it as really the only thing that should be elevated within society. I'll read that to you. From a young age, I idolized scientists, so I studied very hard and scored third in my province among some 100,000 high school graduates in China's brutally competitive national college entrance examinations. I was then accepted in 1983 by the inaugural Department of Genetics and Genetic Engineering at Fudan University, freshly established by the geneticist Dr. C.C. Tan, a protege of Nobel Prize laureate Thomas Morgan, who discovered the role of chromosomes in heredity. So this scientist, Dr. Joe Wang, is someone who has come from China and has done much genetic research. His whole background is in the formation of vaccines. He is definitely not a non-vaxxer at all, and yet he is very concerned about the response that those who are in positions of power are having as a result of their influence upon the medical establishment and health care of nations from their very skewed perspective and from the fact that they have a lot of financial personal interest in how these things are handled. He is basically raising the red flag of corruption, and this is something that we're going to see more and more as we do more of a deep dive into how things have been handled. He goes on and he talks about the gain-of-function research that this paper talks about, the gain-of-function research resulting in the creation of potential pandemic pathogens, written in 2015. Folks, again, I just want to make clear that as of 2012, they had already a horseshoe bat coronavirus that would attach to ACE2 receptors on human cells 99.9% of the time. This isn't something that just happened in 2019. They had formed these viruses. They were playing with these viruses. They were playing God in the laboratory. And we had, between the years of about 1970 and the year 2000, there were numerous articles that were written in Time Magazine and Newsweek and so forth about bioethics. The front page of Time Magazine on more than one occasion talking about what is happening in the lab and how to have some sort of ethical and moral oversight of these scientists who, just because they had the technology, could do things that not only could be, very dangerous to humanity, but would really come up against all kinds of moral boundaries and violate moral boundaries. And this is exactly what we've seen with this pandemic and the origins of this virus. They were producing chimeric coronaviruses, a bat coronavirus that could infect human beings. And many scientists argued at that time that gain-of-function research was too risky, and as a result, it was banned in the United States in October of 2014. However, the language of that ban upon this gain-of-function research was really more or less, we're going to look the other way, and you can't do this and this, but we're not going to keep you from doing this, this, and this. And this is how then they got around this, shifted this to Wuhan, and then funded it with a $3.7 million grant through the EcoHealth Alliance. And that was Dr. Fauci's doing, and he has now positioned himself really to cover his tracks in this whole matter of gain-of-function research and the funding of this very dangerous shifting of all of this very dangerous research over to the Wuhan lab in China. Believe me, there are people who have gotten filthy, filthy rich over this entire situation. Dr. Wang ends up basically saying that scientific research must be guided by the highest moral principles and with enough scrutiny to avoid human-wrought catastrophes, such as from nuclear technology or genetic engineering. I think it's very important that we go in our next segment to examining the ties between the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and specifically Bill Gates himself, and the World Economic Forum and the CDC, because there is now a move that has followed this pandemic to specifically eliminate any possibility of even talking any other story than what they establish to begin with, that the narrative will be in contradiction of the science, in contradiction of scientific papers, in contradiction of frontline doctors, in contradiction of research scientists. They are coming up with a battle plan in order to make it illegal to talk about anything other than what the government says. And this is so much like communist Russia. I don't know that you know right now, but in Russia, it is completely and totally against the law to say the word war or invasion in connection with Putin's special military operation in Ukraine. People are being arrested and thrown in prison for saying stop the war in Ukraine. They are being thrown in prison. In fact, they're having their legs broken at protests over saying that there's an invasion of Ukraine by Russia, which of course the whole rest of the world knows. But they have total and complete control over the internet and what anyone is allowed to say in their country. And so this is exactly what's being planned for the next pandemic, which Bill Gates has made a very specific statement that's very frightening. that there is most certainly going to be a next pandemic. Now, when you think about this and the fact that the last pandemic was in the early 1900s with the Spanish flu, as soldiers came back from World War I, and everyone was exhausted. Everyone had a poor diet, and they had no antibiotics to fight the secondary infections from influenza. Many, many people died all across the earth. But Bill Gates is saying, we're going to have another pandemic soon, as if he is a prophet or as if he is making a promise. This is very frightening because Dr. Anthony Fauci in 2016, before the election, made the statement that the next administration was going to experience a pandemic. So what is going on behind the scenes? What is going on behind the curtain? Who is pulling the strings, and what is their agenda? We are going to look at that in some greater detail. In the name of planning for this next pandemic that we are being promised by Bill Gates and others, they are coming up with recommendations for improving America's readiness for the next pandemic. I want to highlight specifically some areas of great concern in what they're planning. They are coming up with a protocol to be put in place that will actually end up in legislation that will make it illegal for anyone, whether they are a scientist with information that has been gained through research, even with double-blind studies. They are looking to be able to eliminate any other voice other than the government's voice or those who have been put in charge of the pandemic from speaking. In other words, they would come against the great mass of doctors who have stood against, and epidemiologists, virologists, vaccinologists, microbiologists, who have come against how this pandemic was handled, and about the fact that scientific information should always be open to debate and should be tested by the scientific method. So you see, they're not concerned really about following the science. They're concerned about getting everyone to follow exactly what they're told. And they are making these decisions in advance over what people will be told. So there are great amounts of information that have been censored. Many people have been concerned about the censoring of board-certified physicians and research scientists who have had many, many years of prominence within their field, such as Dr. Robert Malone, who was the initiator. He came up with the way that the mRNA platform could actually work to be able to get mRNA into cells in order to build an mRNA vaccine. And he is standing against much of what is being said by those who are in control, and he is being now slandered, he's being censured, he's being censored, and this is all within these various powers within public health and within the medical community are aligning to come against anyone who doesn't stay in step with what Bill Gates and the World Economic Forum, along with the WHO and the CDC, who are all very much affected by funding. This is all about where the money comes from. Who gets to talk and who gets to say what the proper approach is to the scientific problem is coming from who has the money. It's very important to understand that. So now they've come up with a new report, National Priorities to Combat Misinformation and Disinformation for COVID-19 and Future Public Health Threats, a call for a national strategy. In this call for a national strategy, they say the COVID-19 pandemic has shown that health-related misinformation and disinformation can dangerously undermine the response to a public health crisis. Contradictory messaging and active subversion have reduced trust in public health responders, increasing belief in false medical cures and politicized public health measures aimed at curbing transmission of the disease. Well, now we know, beyond a shadow of a doubt, from all of the scientific research, that the vaccine does not protect you from spreading the disease. It does not protect your neighbor. So all of this false virtue posturing and self-righteous kind of I'm a good citizen because I'm vaccinated has been shown to be completely false. Not only can you get the virus and transmit it, but when it came to Omicron, you could get Omicron easier if you were vaccinated. And that's partially because the vaccine is against one single protein on the surface of the coronavirus that has 26 proteins. It's the S1 spike protein, and it's the S1 spike protein from 2 years ago. That would be like you going to your doctor and saying, I want a flu vaccine this fall for the variants that they think are going to come out, because that's how they do the flu vaccines every fall. They do studies to see what seems to be spreading worldwide, and then they make a projection on what should be in the flu vaccine, and they give you a vaccine based upon their studies. But if you went to your doctor and he said, well, hey, I have this really good vaccine from the flu that was 5 years ago, we'll just use that. How would you feel about that? Do you think you'd be protected about something that happened 5 years ago? Well, this is the kind of misinformation and disinformation that's actually being fomented by those who are saying that they're going to come against misinformation and disinformation. And how much sense does that make? Think, people, think. Put on your thinking cap. They have vaccine on the shelves that they cannot get rid of. Hundreds of thousands of doses in the United States alone are sitting there, and they're trying to force it on children who don't even get sick from the disease and who would actually get the Omicron protection, which Bill Gates himself says is better than the vaccine because it gives B cell and T cell immunity. You see, one of the problems is that the vaccine does not give you any serum neutralizing antibodies. Serum neutralizing antibodies are what keeps you from getting the virus. It would stop the virus. You wouldn't get it at all. But it doesn't produce serum neutralizing antibodies. And the paper that I showed you last time showed that they knew this all the way back in 2012 and 2013. They knew from the research they were doing at that time that the vaccines they were coming up with then could not produce serum neutralizing antibodies. So you can lose this whole virtue signaling idea that somehow you are protecting your neighbor or your grandparents by getting the vaccine. The only thing you're doing is to protect yourself from going onto a ventilator in the emergency room. It will protect you enough that you will not get the more severe aspects of the disease, but it does not protect your neighbor. It does not protect your grandparents. It does not protect your own family. And in fact, it has been shown conclusively that Omicron infects people who have been vaccinated more easily than those who are not vaccinated, or those who have actually recovered from previous variants. So you have to understand that there is a narrative that is pro-vaccine, and this is part of the reason that they have suppressed information on repurposed medications that can treat this disease, and they have basically censored and shut down any voice that rises up to speak against different forms of treatment. Perhaps you'll remember when President Trump got the beta version of this, the beta variant of this disease at 77 years of age, and he is obese, and he's under a lot of stress. So he would be the perfect candidate to be extremely seriously ill and potentially die. And yet you remember that with monoclonal antibodies and interferon, and they were giving him ivermectin, he survived and actually came out of the hospital very quickly. He didn't even stop working while he was in the hospital. It's time to think, people. It's time to think about what is actually happening, what is being put forth upon our country. The fact that in the past our government told us that DDT was safe and effective, the fact that in the past our government was involved in actively giving people, Black Americans, Afro-Americans, the syphilis virus in Tuskegee, and those studies that went on all the way, I believe, up to 1970, or perhaps the early 70s. It's important for you to have a healthy level of skepticism and to do some reading and research yourself. So now all of the things that are happening are planning towards the next pandemic and how they will handle what they're calling infodemics. Because you see, they don't want even research scientists or other doctors to have any other narrative than what they want in promoting a vaccine that makes big pharma, big government, big tech, and the news media giants very, very wealthy. I think I'll leave it there today, and we'll look in the future at exactly what's going to be happening as they look forward to improving how they can respond to public health crises, which is a good thing, except we're going to show that they are using AI models and so forth for producing countermeasures for dealing with information, etc. In other words, they want to completely and totally control what you are told, and they want to eliminate some of the information about therapeutics because they want to sell vaccine. This is Dr. Gregg with Dr. Gregg Talks Story, and hope that you've been informed a little further through these things. These are all standard source reference papers. All of these, most of these from the Johns Hopkins Medical Library, Bloomberg School of Public Health, and also from research scientists such as Dr. Wang and many others who are weighing in on this pandemic and the virus and what we need to be aware of going forward. Thank you very much for listening, and I hope you have a great day.